Before I begin this quick lecture, I just want to tell everybody that I'm thinking about you all and I'm hoping that you're all staying safe. This is quite a strange time, and please know that I will work with you all when, if things get confusing or whatever. Please be sure to let me know. I also wanted to let you know that I'm going to upload a viewing guide for this particular lecture. So if you wanted to print it out, it's just a way to organize your notes. If you wanted to go ahead and print that out and just make sure that you're getting the information in the organized way that you need it. But I get it if you choose to do this a different way. I also wanted to remind you that we do have that final project, and classroom communication is a critical topic no matter what age, level, content area you're teaching. So this does have a lot of potential for the topic that you could choose to have for your personal inquiry. Okay, so in today's lesson, we're going to define communication, and we're going to look at these different key elements of communication, of classroom communication: the function talk, the types of communication, the structures of communication, the teacher talk, and the student talk. And then you're going to use what we do in this particular lesson to analyze a lesson using these elements. So you're going to be given an element, and you're going to analyze it. You're going to use Flipgrid, which I know that might stress some of you out. I'm thinking mostly about Josh, ha ha ha. But I think that this has a lot of potential for us. So let me get rid of this little notification. A little potential for us, and I want to try to find ways for us to engage and remain active with each other. If it would be better for us to do this synchronously, we can move to that. Originally, I was thinking that if I gave you some flexibility because of all of the changes, and that's why I chose to do this where you have an asynchronous. But keep communicating with me. Let me know what you need. I'm trying to adapt and figure out, how to best meet these needs in these very different times. There's no, what I say, instruction manual for a pandemic for us, right? Okay, so the first thing I want to start with when we're talking about classroom communication, I want to talk about what is communication. And so the first thought I had is to just find, and I looked up tons of different definitions of communication, and this is the one that I found in one of the books, and I really like it. Communication is the process of passing information and understanding from one person to another. I think the reason I like that is because it doesn't emphasize one type of communication. I think especially now in today's world, we have so many different ways of communicating. We have visual communication, we have oral communication, we have multimodal that use visual, oral, you communicate through music. And so I just thought that that was kind of a cool definition. If you have the viewing guide, you may want to take a minute and just kind of what are the three most important words? What are the words that resonate for you to help you to really understand what communication is? Because if we say our goal as a teacher is to engage in effective classroom communication, we need to know what that goal is really about. What are we really looking at? What's the end goal? All right. So when we look at a classroom, there's a lot of different reasons that people talk. There's a lot of different reasons for talk in the classroom. And I want you to know there is a lot of evidence that demonstrates that teachers dominate more than 96% of the classroom talk. And yes, I know this is kind of ironic that I'm saying this in a lecture format and that, there's no way for you to be communicating back with me. So I'm fully aware of the irony here, but I want you to think about that. 4% of classroom time is when students are able to actively communicate themselves. With everything we know about students, with everything we know about their ability to focus and their needs for, for engagement, that's a really hard sell. So what kind of classroom talk is going on? What are the purposes for the classroom talk? Most important, but probably often taking, subverted by the other two types of talk, is the content talk. That's the talk that's around the learning goals. That's the talk that is looking at, what are you trying to learn? What is the learning objective? And so that content talk obviously is going to vary from lesson to lesson, but it's the idea of the talk around what you're trying to teach your students, whether you're looking at little guys and you're talking about trying to talk to them about phonemes and letter recognition, or you're talking about older guys and you're talking about how to derive an equation. And so these are all, that content talk is what's being learned. And very important in a classroom, and coming off of the classroom management, you can certainly understand why these two do take a really important and sometimes they take the front seat in the classroom, rightfully so, is procedural talk, which is when you're trying to get your students to understand what is going to happen in the classroom. What are the rules? What are the procedures? What are we going to do in the classroom to get to the learning, right? And so the procedural talk is important and also can be very, very detrimental if you can't do procedural talk in a way that a student can easily follow the directions. And then the last one is control talk, and that's where you're going to use your time as a teacher to correct misbehavior, to redirect students, to get them back onto task. And so control talk is another aspect of classroom communication, that when psychologists study classroom communication, that's really what they're looking at. They're looking at content talk, procedural talk, and control talk. And no, 100% of the classroom time is not devoted on those three types of functions of classroom talk, but those others are considered digressions and lost time. Okay, so what are the ways that we communicate? Who do we communicate to? Well, there's several different ways. There's teacher to students as a whole, right? That's one type of communication. So you see the teacher addressing the entire class. You may see the teacher addressing an individual student or a group of individual students, and so those, that's one other type of communication. You see students communicating to the whole class, so maybe addressing an entire class with an answer to a question, or maybe giving a formal a talk, maybe presentation in class. So that's one type. You might see groups of students communicating to the entire class. Again, things like presentations, stuff like that. And then you could see student to student, where they're talking in small groups to each other, and that's another type of classroom communication. And all of these are set up in the procedures, really. That's why procedural talk is so important for in the classroom, because the expectations and the norms for each type of classroom communication is set up in the procedural talk. Another thing that's important to understand is that we have an unintended communication in the classroom. These are the messages that are received maybe without there being an intended reception. They didn't really think about it. So one of the examples in the textbook was some examples of unintended verbal communication. Might be things like telling a student, this isn't on the test, but you need it for background. Really, what the student hears is, you don't need to know this, especially if you're a teacher who has demonstrated an emphasis on what's on the test. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Another unintended communication could be what's left out. So if you are, say, talking about, you're doing a lesson on something like famous writers, and you don't talk at all about any women writers, or maybe you don't talk about any minority writers, you may have unintentionally communicated to the students that writing is for white men. And so that's something that we want to consider, and that's one of the reasons for all of the diversity and looking at culturally responsive pedagogy and questions of that type. But there's a lot of unintended communication that can happen verbally. The other thing that you might consider is like the teacher verbal communication. The teacher might constantly be asking questions of the disrupting student because they're trying to keep them on task. But then the unintentional communication to the rest of the class is that student is more important than them. Nonverbal communication is also important, and as teachers we need to be very aware of that, because we are one, and in a classroom of, even if you're a intervention specialist, you might have 5 or 8, but generally you're one in a classroom of 20 or 25. Their eyes are all looking at you, and so it's unnerving sometimes. You go through this and realizing that you're on stage, but if you do eye rolls, if you cross your arms, if you seem closed off, those are nonverbal communications. And the students, as teachers, we need to be looking for those students' nonverbal communications too. We could be doing a lesson thinking it's going really well, but when you look out, you see that your kids, their eyes are half closed, they're not taking notes. Suddenly that nonverbal communication should be telling you something. And so one really important aspect of nonverbal communication is eye contact. And that's important to consider because eye contact you know, um, is also a cultural expectation. And in some cases, eye contact is something that some students, especially students with cognitive differences, like maybe autism, that they have different needs than maybe is culturally normed in traditional American schools. And so eye contact is something that you want to consider, but you could also consider whether or not you're overusing eye contact. I had a colleague that I worked with several years ago that one of her evaluations told her that her eyes were too buggy, and she got very upset. And I think it was horribly written. I think the assistant principal who did the evaluation, the observation, and the evaluation really kind of like screwed up there. But I know what I think they were trying to say is that you were overusing eye contact, because we have to remember that as teachers there is a power dynamic when we talk, and certainly in things like these nonverbal communication, there's a power dynamic. So if you are engaging in and constantly looking at your students with eye contact, you might actually be intimidating them. And so I think that's what they intended to say, but it wasn't very well said. And you can imagine that my colleague was not too happy, and that evaluation was not too helpful in helping her to improve her craft. Okay, another aspect to consider in classroom communication is the structure of the communication, how that communication is being done. First one is a lecture, and the lecture is obviously this is going from teacher-centered to student-centered, least to most teacher-centered to least teacher-centered. Lecture is obviously the most teacher-centered type of communication that you can have, and obviously this is an example of it. It is good for quick, there is a value for it. I mean, even when we're looking at workshop-style classrooms, mini lessons, but you want to think about there's a lot of evidence that demonstrates that it's overused and it has limited success. Students are much better off doing something than just hearing something. The next one is question and answer. Now, there's a lot of different types of questions that a teacher can ask. A teacher can ask questions that engage a student's prior knowledge, maybe to kind of develop a sense of curiosity, maybe to draw connections from today's learning from what they've done in the past. So those questions can be extremely effective. But what we tend to see most teachers kind of draw to are test-related questions. And those test-related questions are not very engaging and tend to sort of train the student to only look for the information that's going to be tested. And sometimes you need that context, and the real meaningful learning goes around the questions that are going to be on the test, and you don't want to overemphasize the test as if that's the only purpose for your communication. Next is discussion, and obviously the whole class discussion has its it starts to get more student-centered, but we all know we've been in classrooms where we can see that there are some definite limitations to this as far as engaging 100% of the students. Your more verbal students are going to be there. You tend to see where the teacher, even in a quote-unquote class discussion, can often dominate the discussion, so we have to be careful about that. And then the last one is group discussion, and that's when the teacher breaks the students into smaller groups, and that tends to be the most obvious student-centered example. That's why you even see things like in a lecture, you'll see me do things like let's have a shoulder talk, right, or table talk. Those are ways to try to break up and move something that is extremely teacher-centered, move it into student-centered. All right, so I kind of got to this, but teacher talk is important, and there's, researchers have found some really important examples of of ways or reasons, functions of the teacher talk. And so one really important thing that a teacher does, that a teacher uses their talk time to do, would be to nominate, terminate, or interrupt the speaker. We want to control the conversation. When we get into student talk, you'll find out that there are ways that students attempt to talk in digression. And so as teachers, we can control that. Sometimes we can overuse that control, and we have to be really, really careful of the power dynamic. So, as a student, as a teacher of the dominant culture, I need to be careful that when I am terminating a student, I want to make sure that I am not terminating or extending control over students that maybe are marginalized, maybe an ELL student or a minority student. I want to make sure that I'm nominating a wide variety of students, that I'm not letting some people, maybe the best student or the teacher's pet or maybe the most disruptive student, that I'm not just nominating, or maybe I'm not just nominating boys. And I want to also be careful. Interruption is something that sometimes we need to do, especially if the student is digressing. Yes, interruptions are a fact of life, but we want to do those carefully, and we want to do those in ways that kind of respect the student. Like, I'm sorry, I was just looking at the time. We've got to get ready I only have 5 more minutes. I need to wrap this up. But to do it in ways that allow them to keep their dignity. Another thing that we do as teachers is to mark what is important and not important. And that can be done in a way that just points the students to when students often get to the learning in their discussions without even realizing that they're getting to the learning. And so you can mark that, and you can do that like, that's a really good idea. I want to get to that later. And so those are things that we can do to kind of put an exclamation point into the discussion, if you will. Another thing we can do is signal boundaries when a student is starting to move into something that maybe is inappropriate, or maybe is going to make some students, maybe they're getting too political in their commentary, or they're making some statements that can make other people feel unwelcome in our classroom. That's when we can start to signal boundaries. You can also signal boundaries when a student is talking too much. You'll have the students that just dominate the conversation. They talk so long, and so you'll say, okay, we need to move on. Those are the types of things that we're talking about. And then the last thing we do as teachers is we ask test questions and prepare the students for the teaching. And I put that last partly because I think that I hope that is the least important thing that we do. I'm this Pollyanna who wants our test to be organic, wants our test to our learning to have naturally brought us to the point where the students are going to be successful in the test rather than teaching to the test. Okay, so how do students talk in the classroom? What have we identified as purposes and functions of student talk? The first one is agenda enforcement, and you'll find this. If you tell a student that you are going to be, wrapping up something at 1:15, you'll always have one student that when it is 11:46, they'll look at the clock and they'll say, you said we were going to be done at 1:15. So agenda enforcement. So be careful what you promise your students, because you will almost always have that student that will enforce that agenda. They're also very useful, though. If you tend to get lost in something, it's also very useful to tell a student, you are the one that needs to do, please remind me at X amount that we have to move on, or that we have to get to the lab, or whatever it might be. Another thing the students do, and they do it beautifully, and it becomes an art to be able to move it, is digression attempts, trying to get us off task. And so that's something that you can consider. I used to run seminars, and one year I had 2 boys that were constantly, I noticed they were constantly at a bout with each other, that they were trying to bring the discussion to Hitler every time. And it was just a stupid, silly thing. Trying to see if I noticed. So their digression attempts in all of our seminars, I would pull them back and I swat them down. And their stupid, what they thought was juvenile joke was undermined by me. Another thing that students engage in is side talk, which is when they're talking to each other, right? We know that, and we want to be careful of that, but we also want to recognize that some amount of side talk, you don't want to over-respond to side talk. It could be as simple as somebody asking, do you have a pencil that I can borrow? Or do you want me to get you a Kleenex? Those types of things. So if you over-respond to side talk, I think then you're going to end up finding that you're you're shutting down what one would consider just decent communication. Another thing that students do is call out, especially your students, your students that their attention span has been tested. So finding ways for them to be able to call out maybe sometimes and kind of getting that out of their, out of their system a little bit could help. Students answer questions, and we know it's very clear to us that is done unevenly, that boys answer questions more readily than girls, that white students answer questions more readily than students of color when we're talking about a classroom of mix. So that's why it's important to not always just have the students raise your hands. Cold calling is also a really good way to engage students. So thinking about how you find the student to answer the questions is kind of cool. And then the last one is silence. And unfortunately, that's the majority of what students do and how students talk in the classroom. They are just silent. Okay, so what we're going to do today, you're going to be given one aspect of communication to evaluate as we watch a video lesson. So I'm going to send a link, and I'm going to upload the link on Leo as well, of a video lecture, or lesson, I mean. And what you're going to consider then is how effective was the aspect of the classroom communication that you were assigned in helping to achieve true communication as defined by passing information and understanding from one person to another. So these are your groups. So Maria, so I've got the two Marias, right? Oh, geez, so let's do this. Maria B. See, I do this all the time to you guys. Maria B and Maria R. Okay, so let's do that. Okay, so Maria B, Corey, Taylor, Josh, you guys are going to look at function of talk. Dora, Maria R, Christina, Jacob, types of communication. Kyle, J, Olivia, Meek, you're going to look at structures of talk. Braden, Emily, Mackenzie, Madison, you're going to look at teacher talk and what her, what functions she uses for her teacher talk. And Anna, Daisy, and Abby, you're going to look at the functions of the student talk and what are the ways that students are engaging and talking. Okay? What's going to happen is you're going to have this question: how effective was this aspect of classroom communication in helping achieve true communication as defined as passing information and understanding from one person to another? And then you're going to back up your statement using evidence from the video. We're going to post this on Flipgrid. We're going to try Flipgrid today. I will send you directions in Flipgrid, but here, let me just go through and then I'll show you Flipgrid in a second. And then the last thing you're going to do is you're going to have a homework assignment where I'm going to share a Google Doc, and you're going to go find an article about a topic that is related to classroom communication. I'm assigning you based on your birthdays. So if you see your birthdays that are January, February, March birthdays, you're going to look at the Initiate, Response, Evaluate model of questioning. It's IRE, and you're going to look for an article that's about that model of questioning. It's a very specific model of questioning. Those of you that have January, February, March, and you're going to look at wait time. Those of you that have April and May B-days, you're going to look at Initiate, Response, Evaluate model of questioning. Those of you that have June, July, August birthdays, you're going to look at teacher talk time. September, October birthdays, you're going to look at classroom discussion techniques. And November and December birthdays, you're going to look at eye contact in the classroom. Any article about that. So what's going to happen is I'm going to share a Google Doc with you. You're going to write about a 3 to 5 sentence summary of that Google Doc. What did you read and what did it tell you about classroom communication? That's what you're going to share. Be sure to put your name on the post in the document. You don't have to do a formal citation. You can just very quickly, I found an Edutopia article, and then go ahead and give me a quick synopsis of that article, okay? So this will be the lesson that you're going to watch. I will post this on Leo. I will send it in the email as well. So this is going to be what you're going to watch to do your Flipgrid. And to do the Flipgrid, here's what you're going to do. Okay, let me open up Flipgrid. So you're going to have to create an account on Flipgrid, okay? And I'm going to ask that you use your login here. And then when you get into Flipgrid, I'll log in here. When you get into Flipgrid, you're going to need 2 topics, okay? So you're going to need to get to my discussion board, okay? Log into Flipgrid. Oh, shoot. Sorry, I got to do my Google login. So to get into Flipgrid, when you get into there, you'll create your account and then it's going to ask you what Flipgrid you want to go to. I have the Flipgrid already set up here, but if you look in here, this is the Flipgrid. So when you log in or when you create it, this is the Flipgrid you want to get into. And then this is the topic. So when you get into your Flipgrid, you are going to see that there is a topic for this. Now you're going to need access to a computer. I don't know why it's doing that. You're going to need access to a computer or a camera. And so here you go. So here's what it looks like. Okay, aspects of communication. And when you get into the Flipgrid, you need a web camera, or I found it easier. You can actually download this on your phone, and I just used my phone, so it's kind of like doing a little selfie, and I use my phone to go ahead and record it. So that's something that you can consider doing. And if you have any questions, I'll send out directions for Flipgrid in an email, but if you have any questions, be sure to let me know. But otherwise, I think it's pretty self-explanatory, and at least it gives us a chance to continue a different way to interact than always doing the discussion board, since now we are looking at, this going on for a while. So, all right, well, I hope everybody stays well. Let me know if you have any questions. Take care, and I will be back in touch.